All right. So last week we were talking about disruption of research and the sort of landscape of research outside of academia. We talked about a few different examples. Independent researcher was one that we mentioned, but maybe didn't spend much time on. And I want to start with that. So I raised the topic of our conversation last week with John Wentworth, who's an independent researcher based in Berkeley, doing AI safety related work, but more broadly trying to understand various issues to do with artificially intelligent agents and how they might think. His work is not too different from some work that takes place in academia, but he approaches it in a very different way. I met him briefly in Berkeley. I think he's a smart guy. And his answer when I asked him about these topics was the following. He said, short answer, that independent research is to academic/industry research as self-employment is to employment. The considerations are basically the same as self-employment more generally. So for instance, when self-employed, it's possible to find mentors, but it won't happen by default. You need to reach out to people yourself. The flip side is that you're forced to do everything the business needs and will therefore gain a lot more hands-on experience a lot faster. Your research agenda is your business plan. Producing legible signs of progress for investors is part of the job. Pivoting is part of the job. Income is uncertain, but the flip side is skin in the game. You can get more money in proportion to legible progress produced. The resulting incentive gradients are far from perfect, but they're at least non-zero. In general, I expect the people who will take well to independent research are exactly the people who would take well to both self-employment and research. And yeah, that seemed reasonable to me. Both my parents ran small businesses, so were self-employed. They employed, reasonable number of other people. I think temperamentally, I understand very well why people opt for self-employment, so I can see the logic there. Any thoughts on that quote? Are you self-employed, Adam? I don't know if it's really the same.
It seems very reasonable. I think. I mean, it seems like it's a reasonable parallel. I'm an employee basically of Rethink X, so it's not like I would imagine that being self-employed is more like pursuing and then being attached to specific projects. Sort of, it's not quite, I don't want to say gigs, but I guess self-employment can be a big spectrum of things, and you can be attached to certain projects for quite a while. But I'm in that sense, in the sense that I'm attached to one organization. I'm basically an employee of that organization, an organization in which there is, it doesn't have an ownership structure or a for-profit structure. So it's a nonprofit with founders. So I don't have equity in the organization. So I guess my employee is the only right way to look at it. But the analogies that's being drawn here to self-employment seems like it makes pretty good sense. So, yeah. Fair enough.
Matt asked what's the pivoting he mentioned. Well, he didn't explain further, but I presume what he means is just changing your research direction over time. And that's probably one of the ways in which the freedom of independent research is a little illusory. I do actually get the point and agree that probably you do have in some ways a larger degree of freedom, but if you want to keep getting grants, you can't be doing something completely incomprehensible to all the grant makers. So perhaps...
Right. When I listened to the quote, I wasn't sure what he was trying to say, but now I think if the quote was pivoting is part of the job or whatever, it means having to pivot your research in order to make it legible to grant makers is part of the job.
Yeah.
That makes sense now. Thanks.
And I think Wentworth's operating in a pretty unusual environment too, right? So AI safety is a bit of an unusual environment in terms of the availability of funding. I don't know of so many other examples that are like that. maybe you do, Adam. I'll just describe what I mean by it being unusual, and we'll see if we can think of other examples. So there is pretty patient long-term funding, or has been for several decades. The scale has varied, but there has been funding for people like Wentworth. I don't know how long. When did he start? We read that in his post, but maybe it was 10 years ago or so. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Matt. So there's been funding for some period of time for not only one person, but a community. I'm not sure that's true. I mean, I am sure it's true that there's nobody out there looking to fund random topics in algebraic geometry for independent researchers to sit in the Bay Area and work on it. So it's not every topic that you'll find funding available for independent researchers like that. So I don't know how much to draw from Wentworth's example, actually. Are there other areas of science where there are independent researchers being patiently funded and it's like actually feasible as a career option?
Oh boy, not that I'm aware of. I mean, again, this harkens back to the idea of sponsorship and patronage that we talked about. Well, it's an old idea, an old model, at least as far as I understand it. And I don't know if that model persists either for individuals or for, sort of at the level of organizations with multiple researchers sort of forming teams that are supported in that way. I suppose that might be more probable than individual researchers being sponsored or receiving patronage. Today, I've not heard of that in other sciences, but one could say that if you just have a slightly larger scale as your level of analysis, and the level of analysis is an organization, then think tanks are kind of in that boat. I mean, so my organization is philanthropically funded. My team is currently small. I mean, it's less than a dozen people in total. And the organization, the team as a whole receives funding, and the directions that our research take are pretty open-ended and self-determined. The outputs are not aimed at anything. We aren't being funded with the goal of spinning out, startups or something along those lines, or generating practical technological applications out of things. I mean, I suppose insights for policymaking and investment are always useful in their way, but that that seems, as long as you're not talking about individual scientists, then the way that my organization is structured is at least an example of how that can be done. But I don't know if there are other sort of domains of science. I mean, I'm trying to think social sciences, natural sciences, where one or a small number of people sort of have philanthropic sponsorship. The only thing I can think of is, via university channels, university mechanisms. So, for example, and Daniel, you guys will of course be familiar with this, but you can have individual philanthropists writing grants to individual researchers on university campuses, but all of that is mediated by the university, and the university takes a cut. And I think at UCLA it was 55% of all the funding, right? So that's the privilege, that the university enjoys, right? So I mean, we had some very deep-pocketed philanthropists writing grants for individual graduate students and individual professors and their research teams and programs at our departments. I'm saying our, but at, my wife and I both at the Luskin School at UCLA, and so I was not a faculty there. I was a student, but I mean, I for several quarters while I was there, I received scholarships and funding from these philanthropic sources, and I met the funder. The philanthropist would be there, and we'd have a dinner, and it would be sort of an annual event, and multiple funders would show up, and you do a bit of glad handing and all that kind of stuff, and have a nice dinner and shake hands and say how much you appreciate the support, and tell the philanthropists about your research and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But the university is taking a big chunk of that. So I don't know if that counts. Is that the university that's it's sort of like facilitating a marketplace, but it's pretty usurious from my perspective. So anyway, I don't know if that's really what you had in mind there.
Yeah, that's an interesting category of funding, but I think it certainly doesn't fall under independent research. I was also funded to some degree by such a channel, although without my knowing, which I find problematic. So new hires, when I was hired at the University of Melbourne, you get a kind of startup package, so-called, where you get some funding for travel and other such things. And that was coming out of a donation from a Melbourne-based rich finance guy who very generously has donated over multiple years to the school. I didn't actually know that was where the startup funding came from until I was asked to go to such a meeting, and glad handle, as you say, which was fine. I have no problem with that. And he seems like a very nice guy and willing to fund pure math research. So that's all good. I don't know what percentage of his donation was taken by the university, but when I was talking to them about this FTX Foundation grant, and that Open Philanthropy has a cap of 10% for overheads, so that they will not actually give gifts that end up, to that degree in the pockets of the university writ large. So there was a bit of argument with the powers that be about that. Anyway, I guess we're getting a bit off topic. I think independent research is sort of interesting. I guess people have various ideas on how to make it work. Probably you could try teaching or like tutoring in some one-on-one way to make a living, and then outside of that you imagine you're going to get research done. I think in practice that probably doesn't work. Maybe some people make it work. Maybe you have the plan of getting rich first, and then you'll have the leisure to do research. I know that's a recurrent fantasy of students finishing graduate degrees in math and physics. They see the lure of finance and they tell themselves, holy crap, look at those salaries. Look, I could just work for 5 years and then I can do research for 10 years, And then they go into finance, and of course, then they wake up and they're like, holy shit, I wasn't really living. I was eating cat food for the last 5 years. Now I've got real money and I can, have a girlfriend and travel and live a life. And then they have some money and then they think about their plan of going on for 10 years eating cat food to do research. And they're like, maybe there's more to life than research. And then they move on. I've seen that happen to a bunch of people. It's not so clear how you fund independent research apart from a generous philanthropist sitting around somewhere behind the scenes. In AI safety, it's not like Wentworth's directly going to the billionaires and asking for money, as far as I know. It's channeled through grant-making organizations and so on, so there's infrastructure there. Any more comments on independent research? I guess this is a topic we can return to, but I want to say something about focused research organizations as well. Yeah, maybe independent research has two potential meanings, right? One is as an individual, and one is as a group of people independent collectively from the more mainstream research community that is academia. I suppose I was just talking about it now as an individual doing independent research like Wentworth. I mean, Wentworth is part of a community, but as far as I know, he's not in an organization. And there are various such people around in AI safety, maybe a handful. I don't want to overstate how many are making a living that way. It's obviously a different kettle of fish if you're a group of people who band together and somehow go after funding. That has different pros and cons. Yeah, does anybody want to comment on that before we move on? All right. Yeah, maybe it would be worth stating at some point what the business model of actual universities is, in case you think that they, like where does their money come from? That's also relevant. Okay, so focused research organization was mentioned last time without giving a definition. Let me give a definition. This is from an article by Sam Rodriguez and Adam Marblestone. I don't know Rodriguez. Adam Marblestone is quite active in this kind of area. So, quote, the US government is ill-equipped to fund R&D projects that require tight coordination and teamwork to create public goods. The majority of government-funded research outside of the defense sphere, including research funded through the National Institute of Health, the National Science Foundation, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, that is DARPA, and ARPA-E, is outsourced to externalized collaborations of university labs and/or commercial organizations. However, the academic reward structure favors individual credit and discourages systematic teamwork. Commercial incentives encourage teamwork, but discourage the production of public goods. As a result, the United States is falling behind in key areas like microfabrication and human genomics to countries with greater abilities to centralize and accelerate focused research. The solution is to enable the US government to fund centralized research programs, termed focused research organizations, to address well-defined challenges that require scale and coordination, but that are not immediately profitable. FROs would be standalone moonshot organizations insulated from both academic and commercial incentive structures. FROs would be organized like startups, but they would pursue well-defined R&D goals in the public interest and would be accountable to their funding organizations rather than to shareholders. Each FRO would strive to accelerate a key R&D area via multiplier effects, such as dramatically reducing the cost of collecting critical scientific data, provide the United States with a decisive competitive advantage in that area, and de-risk substantial follow-on investment from the private and/or public sectors. End quote. Yeah, let me see if I can find some examples. Mostly the ones I've seen are in health sciences. Existing FROs include Eve Bio on a 5-year mission to map the pharmome, whatever the hell that is, by building a public knowledge map of FDA-approved drugs' functional protein binding partners. Rejuvenome, established to conduct the largest and most systematic study of biological effects of anti-aging interventions. Cultivarium, that's a promising name, create open source tools for life scientists to expand access to novel microorganisms. E11 Bio, yeah, mapping the human brain, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so there's quite a lot of those in the health sector. I think that's not an accident. Yeah, that's right. It's something governments want to fund. It's something pharma companies want to buy. So there's both like public benefit from, say, some data set being released, but also like kind of community into which the FRO can go. Yeah, it's an interesting model. I don't know to what degree it's actually been successful, but people are quite excited about it, at least in this sector. I haven't seen so much outside of that. One thing I want to highlight, which is in common between this quote I just read and also the attitudes of some people in the Bay Area in the AI safety community towards academia, is that this 55% figure that Adam just quoted, I think fits into a broader picture of some in the government and other funding organizations of academia as basically a kind of grift where the academic incentives are basically just to publish papers and climb up some ladder and not to actually solve deep problems. And there is a lot of truth to that, obviously. going with FROs is a bit of an extreme move, I guess, which you could read as a vote of no confidence in the effectiveness of funding university research. Obviously, what I just read, producing goods that are in the public interest and not, reactive to financial incentives like that would justify running a startup or having a company do it. That's what academia is supposed to be for. So the fact that you need to go and fund some research organization outside of the grips of a university to get it done is hardly an endorsement of the university-based research ecosystem. And yeah, similar critiques. Probably I mentioned last time.
It is discouraging. I certainly can't speak to the universities outside of the United States, but of the ones in the United States that I have direct experience with, what's discouraging from a funding perspective for research is that the contributions from external sources of funding are still directed towards the general expenses the university incurs through operations. When one would imagine, certainly hope, that these stupefyingly large increases in student tuition fees would be adequate to cover the university's operating costs. And this is very puzzling. Like, for example, if you had deep pockets and you were funding university, you'd be very sorely tempted to ask, why does 55%, why does more than half of what I'm contributing need to go to support the university's day-to-day operations when you're charging more students more money than ever? How did the university operate perfectly fine 40 years ago with half as many students and a tiny fraction of the administrators and without much help from computers? And why am I paying for this as a funder? Why should I be paying for the new cafeteria for the students? Why should I be paying for new seats in the sports arena? Why should I, et cetera, et cetera? If what I'm really interested in is funding research. And yet it does seem, unfortunately, like focused research organizations are a way to simply more efficiently direct resources to what you want to direct them towards. And it sounds like the universities maybe took things a little bit too far, and they ceased to retain their monopoly on the channels of funding to the highest performing and most qualified researchers, and other solutions. Like that inefficiency carved open some space for new entrants into that marketplace, as it were. And now you've got alternatives emerging that are leaner, and it's understandable. But it's also a predictable outcome of bureaucratic bloat, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. The other factor here is in the quote, moonshot organizations. For better or worse, academia is just not structured to do that anymore, despite claims to the contrary. I think it just isn't what the structure of academia is aiming at, moonshots, so to speak. Of course, nobody has ever expected academia to literally aim at moonshots. This term has been diluted to a great degree. It would be ridiculous to expect academia to marshal the hundreds of thousands of people and what was it, $100 billion or more, to literally run the Apollo program. But if by moonshot we mean like slightly more ambitious than normal projects, it does happen in academia, but that isn't what most of academia is aiming at. It's not even clear whether to critique it for that. It's kind of unrealistic to expect that. It's also not clear that FROs will succeed at that, right? So obviously if you Google for focused research organization, you'll find articles by people founding them or interested in them or wanting to hype this as an alternative to a system they think has problems, and so they're inclined to, and it's a kind of unproven model, so they're inclined to write their hopes rather than what is actually going on, I would expect. most of these FROs also fail to really achieve anything. That's the nature of research, and should be understood as par for the course if you're trying to do hard things. I think the upshot is, as far as I can tell, that nobody knows how to do it. Nobody knows how to reliably bring new knowledge, radically new knowledge, forward from the future in some way that is like highly effective. Some historical exceptions are ARPA, the predecessor to DARPA, which funded PARC, P-A-R-C, which was basically a focused research organization around producing networked computer interfaces, and that was the organization that gave rise to the GUI and the mouse and the first networked computers and the first word processing, document creation applications, and so on. The mother of all demos. You've probably all heard this story. Maybe we can talk about that example in some more detail some other time. But that, I suppose, if it was existing today, would be referred to as that was under Xerox, so it wasn't an independent thing, but it was a research lab within a company, and strongly funded. Yeah, that's an interesting division. I'm open to where to take the conversation next. One thing we could do is talk about DeepMind as an example of a research organization of a different kind to any of the other ones we've discussed so far. But Adam, Matt, are there other topics you want to bring up before we do that?
It seems good to me.
Okay.
One thing that it might be worth unpacking in a little bit of detail is the content of research itself, right? I mean, so research as a general concept is okay. I mean, I certainly don't object to it as a kind of a category, but it's not all equally practicable, in the sense that not all research even has potential to result in practical applications of the same kind, or of the same import or impact, certainly not on the same time scales. And so judging the value of it, you'd have to maybe have some guidelines for evaluating the usefulness of the research and its outputs itself. And I think it's probably worth recognizing that not all scientific fields, offer the same potential to produce knowledge that is going to be, result in improvements in products or goods or services, or be otherwise actionable in different ways. I think that's a perennial problem within the universities, and it's almost certainly a problem in any other research structure as well, right? The temptation will be to only fund research that looks like it has a high probability of yielding insights or knowledge, or that can be developed rapidly into marketable goods and services. But that results in some incentives that work against an optimal research output that would be more balanced, that would allow the pursuit of lines of inquiry that don't necessarily have a clear application a priori, but that experience has shown sometimes produce fantastically useful unexpected results. And so the justification for funding basic research, as I've heard it called, is sound, but that certainly shapes the incentives around whoever, or the incentives of whoever is reaching into their pockets and writing big checks to support the research. So, and some research, I suppose you could argue, is sexier than others in some ways, or from certain perspectives. Maybe it's more topical. Maybe it's easier to sell its potential benefits to the public and policymakers than others. So, I think I'm just lodging this caveat that the actual content of the research is an important consideration, and not just the structure of the organizations that are conducting research. Because I think those two things, sort of like, one hand shakes the other, two sides of a coin, whatever, pick your metaphor.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so DeepMind, I suppose you all know who DeepMind are, but maybe you don't know that the original business plan, DeepMind was funded as a for-profit, I believe, but its original business plan was to make games. So that makes a lot of sense if you know the CVs of some of the people involved. So David Silver, who's famous, of course, for AlphaGo, led that team. I believe I'm correct in saying that Demis Hassabis met David Silver while he was running his games company, which I believe was between his PhD and postdoc. He'd been part of games companies for a long time, since he was a teenager. His first job, I think, was making Theme Park and some other things for Bullfrog. I could be wrong with all this, but I believe that's right. And then he ran his own games company for a bit, and then was always wanting to do AI as a career. And then they looked around and wanted to start working on AGI, seeing the progress in deep learning. And so they had this idea to do reinforcement learning and deep learning. And then they tried to think about how they could actually fund that. And their original business plan, that I think is what they took to the original funders like Elon Musk and so on, was that they'd run a joint game/research company, which is certainly not one of the ones that was on the board last time. The idea would be that they would make games that would have AI in them, and that they would use that commercial success to drive fundamental research into AI. Sounds pretty cool. I guess that plan lasted about 15 minutes, and they got bought by Google. And then the river of money started flowing, and of course they had orders of magnitude more access to compute that way than they would have running a game company. It would be very interesting to go and examine that timeline where DeepMind was spitting out amazing AI-powered games, and on the side publishing Nature papers. I'd love that. I'd love that model to exist. So that's interesting. And cultured AI. Oh, that's right. Yeah. So that's right. I had seen those. I'd forgotten about them, but that's kind of the original. That's the OG business model. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so what is DeepMind now in terms of, that's sort of an aside, interesting. What's interesting about DeepMind from the point of view of this conversation is that it's a research organization, but it's kind of its own entity. So it's not like an academic department in the sense that you have people basically completely independent. Again, I'm going off published descriptions of how DeepMind works and things that Demis Hassabis has said. I haven't worked there, obviously, or talked about it in length with anybody who does. So it's not like an academic department where you have basically complete independence, modular having to apply for funding, people work in groups. It's driven by the following logic, which is that you try many things, and then when something starts to be working, then people are supposed to jump on that bandwagon and scale it up. So every project we've heard of coming out of DeepMind, like AlphaGo, AlphaStar, AlphaFold, etc., would have started as one of these experiments with a small number of people, and then under review, the sort of people higher up the hierarchy make judgments about what is working and what isn't, and those that are working get more people put onto them. So I don't know how voluntary that process is or how much you just get told what to work on, but that's roughly how it works internally. Now, it's been very successful. You could say that, well, anybody can be successful with $500 million a year in funding. No, go look at a university. DeepMind has had more research impact than most universities, which typically have much higher budgets than DeepMind. So I think it's not actually the case that they just have piles of money and that relative to their capital, they're not that productive. I think the model is successful. In my opinion, the success of DeepMind is a profound challenge to the current order of doing scientific research outside of DeepMind. Yeah, so that's a brief intro. Any questions about that or comments? I don't know what percentage of the funding is salary. Probably non-trivial.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Obviously, they have a big compute budget. I don't know what discount rate they get that at, since they're kind of buying it off Google, so to speak. Also don't know how much this example really informs the discussion, because it's not exactly like you can just go out and beat DeepMind. Right. How much do you know about Encultured AI, Matt? What's their model?
Only what's on their website, which is, I think they view it as like a contribution to AI alignment to create like a metaverse where humans and AI can interact to sort of see how that plays out. So like you can try out alignment strategies in this virtual world and see if it goes well. And you can do that before you then allow the AIs or allow the alignment strategies to be used in the real world. So yeah, that might be, I'm not sure if that's like a full picture of what they're doing. I don't know that there's been that much output from the organization, and it's a small team as well. And they've like got position descriptions up on their website for hiring developers for various roles. So I think, it's fairly early stages. Like, I don't think they have a game yet.
Yeah. Could you say briefly who Andrew Critch is?
Yeah, Andrew Critch is actually an algebraic geometer, I guess, by training. So he's worked at Berkeley and was part of the Center for Human Compatible AI, Stuart Russell's research lab. And yeah, he's still there, I think, like a couple of hours a week or something. But I think officially, according to his website, is like spending most of his time at being the founder of Encultured AI, last I heard.
Cool.
Oh yeah, one other thing about him is that he's the co-author with David Kruger on my favorite review or sort of introduction to AI safety, which is the Arches framework.
Yeah, that was a good one. Yeah, so maybe people should start more game companies.
On that note, actually, I'll add one more thing, which is that I think making a game, especially a massively multiplayer online game, is like really, really hard and high probability of failing somewhere along the line. So people, when Encultured AI was kind of like launched or announced in like the EA circles, that was like the main point of feedback that they got, was like this, like skepticism that this would be able to get off the ground, even if it was like in principle a good idea.
Well, I suppose that's probably true of all really new things. I mean, DeepMind's plans in 2010 looked, of course, even more stupid than Encultured AI's plans look in.
Right, because they wanted to make games and also solve AGI, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I guess we'll continue many of these threads. Adam, you can make any comments you want to on DeepMind, but you also wanted to talk a bit about Elon Musk's new organization, which I suppose is a reasonable segue from talking about DeepMind. Shall we do that?
Well, sure. I mean, I think that this is the thing I'm interested in discussing. I mean, I of course I'm interested in how research teams are organized, structured, funded, and so forth, and what their business models are, if they have any degree of self-funding, which of course, in the original case of DeepMind, in the case of Encultured AI, those are interesting dynamics to explore. But the reason why I was interested in, what is it, XAI? Is that Musk's new one? Is this thing that I'm most interested in is the ostensible, the espoused or declared mission and purpose of these organizations. Like and we could sort of, maybe we could ignore whether or not they are truly pursuing those stated missions authentically and with a lot of fidelity. But even if we just set that aside, the practical realities aside, and just kind of evaluate the mission and so I guess it's two things really. It's sort of the means and the ends. Like, what is the end that these organizations are variously pursuing, and exactly like in specific terms, not the broad terms of we're trying to align AI so humanity doesn't get wiped out, but more specifically than that. Like, what are they trying to achieve specifically as goals, and what are the means? How are they trying to achieve those goals? So what are their goals, and what are the means they're using to pursue those? And one reason why I thought XAI might be interesting to look at is it's a genuinely different approach to what I've seen espoused elsewhere. Now, whether or not that's, it has any value or validity or usefulness, I don't know. I'm keen to know what you guys think, because you're much more knowledgeable about and wiser than I am about all of those sorts of things. But to my eye, it got my attention because it's different, and in the spirit of experimentation, different is not necessarily bad, right? My team, for example, we are often asked by stakeholders of all kinds, okay, disruption's coming, what should we do? And if nobody has a single answer to which everybody should conform to in terms of a solution, well, what's the other thing? What's the next best option? Well, explore the space of possible solutions as rapidly and as widely and as safely as you can. And I'm just not confident that 3 organizations is enough to explore all of the possible solutions in the space. So, or maybe 4 if you include open source. But if we've got OpenAI and Google and Apple, and OpenAI is I'm lumping together with Microsoft now, I mean, that's not enough to explore the solution space. We've got to have more. And honestly, to be quite frank, I can't tell the difference between what those companies are doing. They all are saying the same thing, or near enough, to my eye. Yeah. And then there's smaller teams, of course, that are doing slightly different things. But so XAI comes along and it's like, okay, well, that seems like it's quite different. You think a possible pathway to safe alignment is to adopt the value of maximizing curiosity? I've not heard that before. Let's think that through. Anyway, that was my interest here. And then from there, that's a specific example. It's like, okay, well, maybe we should be thinking through all of these missions and alleged means for getting there. And how, is because then that would shed some light on, well, okay, well, do these companies have a chance in hell of actually achieving their missions? Do we think they're completely misguided? And should we instead be, returning to the previous conversation about, okay, well, maybe we need different types of organizations that will have a better chance of pursuing a wide range of different ends with a wide range of different means. And with so much uncertainty and so much confusion and so little ability to accurately predict what outcomes are going to be here, man, I think we should be throwing absolutely gargantuan amounts of funding at as many different approaches as we can think of, no matter how ridiculous some of them might be. I mean, we really do need to throw $1 trillion or more of funding at AI safety. And if we can think of 100 different things, 90 of them are going to be goofball, but why the hell not? We should be funding absolutely everything we can possibly think of, because, What's the alternative? We got to do it. We have to explore this possibility space. So yeah, I mean, that's my take on it. And okay, maybe Musk's new initiative is ridiculous, but at least it's different. So
yes, well, amen. Except maybe we shouldn't fund absolutely everything if within that set of attempted solutions to alignment are make the scary things go much faster through misguided attempts to solve the problem.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Which, okay, question mark, is XAI such a thing? I don't know. Maybe let's say briefly what it is before we get into its sort of likelihood of ending the world or saving it. So it's a new AI, hesitant to call it a research org because I don't think that's what Musk does, but maybe it's similar to Neuralink in the sense that it is doing fundamental research in a direction which is going towards potentially very lucrative products. But at the moment Neuralink is very much in a, well, it's a commercialization mindset. It's doing fundamental research to some degree, but I think there's a lot of research lying around in that field that needs capital in order to commercialize and talent that wants to do it. And Musk is good at spotting those opportunities. I guess he could be trying to do the same thing here. They haven't announced, as far as I know, what their end products will be. I guess we'll find out. Tell me if you know more. What we do know is who's a part of it. And some of those have commented on Twitter on, somewhat cryptically what they want to do. Sorry, Chad, I didn't mean Neuralink. Yeah, I suppose their products are pretty clear. I meant XAI. So Chris Szigeti, who is one of the inventors of various vision architectures, very famous deep learning researcher, was at Google, has been for the last 5 years or more, basically laser focused on theorem proving and automating the formalization and proof of mathematical theorems. So he's stated very clearly that his long-term goal when he was at Google was to basically have AIs read the math literature, understand it, and be able to prove new theorems. So he's coming after us. So that's his focus. I doubt he's changed his focus. I think that means that XAI will have a large component of investigating the fundamental mathematics of deep learning and also attempting to automate the production of mathematics. Greg Yang was at Microsoft Research. He's done work in theory of deep learning and is, as I've said publicly before, his work is maybe one of two things out of the theory of deep learning that's actually amounted to anything in terms of impacts. Most theory of deep learning is kind of not going anywhere. There's a handful of things that have gone somewhere. Scaling laws is one. That's obviously reshaping the world. You have Forbes articles talking about scaling laws these days. It's quite surreal. Greg Yang's work on tensor programs played a significant role in accelerating training for some of these frontier models. Now it's kind of a bit in the weeds, but if you're in the know and doing at the coalface, I think you're sort of aware of the impact of some of his work. And he's one of the other major headlining people there. There's other people that would be well known to people in machine learning, but I kind of recognize their names, but I don't know what they do. I haven't looked more closely at it. But just these two together indicates very strongly, I think, it's a kind of a mathy research organization, perhaps aiming at, if I had to guess, I would say they're aiming to develop a fundamental theory of deep learning. I think they've said as much in Twitter posts, and then prove that they're correct and use that understanding to align the AI. I don't know to what degree Musk's pronouncements on maximizing curiosity really map onto the research organization's priorities. Musk goes around saying lots of things. I'm not sure the Neuralink people really do what Musk tells them. I'm not sure Starlink. I'm not sure the day-to-day operation of Musk's other companies really aligns with his public statements. So yeah, that's my understanding of what they're doing. But let's, I guess, take the statement about maximizing curiosity at face value. Do you remember more than just this term, Adam? I maybe wouldn't be able to summarize it.
Well, I mean, Elon Musk is, it's tough when you don't see much in print from him. And so he's normally just speaking when you get these things, these sorts of statements out of him. And he's not particularly articulate when he speaks. And I mean, I don't know, maybe that works perversely in his in his favor in some ways. But so it leaves a lot open to interpretation, and then that gets spun and taken in various different directions. So this is all to say that I don't think we've got anything terribly concrete from him yet. We may have the official statements of XAI themselves, but as far as he goes, I have an interpretation, or at least my own interpretation, that I thought was provocative for my own thinking, and this claim that a core value of curiosity. In other words, if you were to adopt curiosity, the value of dedicating time and energy and resources to discovering what is and isn't, I suppose you could argue, valid knowledge and of various forms. Valid meaning that it maps accurately to what you can observe and what you can test. Then this is something like saying that your assumption is that the pursuit of knowledge and truth is somehow likely to lead to a corresponding values with respect to other moral agents that are benign. And as a scientist, this is just there's something there's something appealing innately about that. It's probably quite idealistic. I mean, it's just it's what a scientist wants to hear. Oh boy, pursuit of the core values of the scientific enterprise, the pursuit of truth, the pursuit of valid explanations. Valid meaning explanations about the observable world that can be replicated and tested and empirically and so forth. Oh boy, would that ultimately lead to a moral realism? In other words, to might that lead to a set of values that result in universal respect for or value or prioritization of conscious beings as interesting phenomena in themselves, deserving of ongoing attention and ongoing curiosity-driven discovery and so forth. Doesn't all of that sound lovely and nice? And boy, scientists could be the scientific enterprise and its associated values of truth-seeking and discovery and blah, blah, blah. Wouldn't it be marvelous if that also corresponded to a moralism or a moral realism or a universal morality that encompassed many different kinds of minds, in a benevolent and benign and constructive as opposed to deeply destructive and competitive way. And so anyway, it's kind of tickles your brain in a devilishly appealing manner. But I do wonder, okay, well, could that be defensible in formal terms? And is Musk setting up an organization that could actually evaluate that and test that as a working hypothesis? I don't know, but my own biases led me to find it very appealing. That's for sure. And it's quite, again, like I said, it's quite different than the other stated missions and means that I've heard from the big corporations and that are involved in this space and so forth. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't know how plausible it is, but wouldn't it be lovely if we lived in a universe where the best way to achieve positive outcomes for, the sentient beings we know of, to be the noble pursuit of truth? Wouldn't that be nice? So yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, I think it's at least honest. So it may be flawed, but I don't think it's maybe easier to make fun of than what other labs are doing, but I fundamentally don't think it's that different. I guess it's not clear to me how you maximize curiosity without first solving the alignment problem. So it feels like a value that you want to reliably put into these systems, and you first have to develop a way of doing that. So maybe incidentally, this is a alignment org and the best funded and most driven one on Earth, and is therefore a good thing, because they first need to solve alignment and then plug in the value, maximize curiosity. Maybe that step ends the world, but maybe maybe they do a lot of good before they get there. I don't know. Maximizing curiosity. It's not obvious to me that leads to discovering, the stone tablets at the center of the galaxy, or whatever you want to call moral realism. Maybe let's make the case for it. So you could say, and I think Elon Musk, he says he's thought about this a lot, which I think for him means on his jet flying between his 300 different companies, he occasionally noodles about these topics. It doesn't seem like he's actually thought about it very deeply, to be blunt. But what he said there is something that I think many people independently come up with. I know my friend Colleen, who I was talking to in Berkeley, a physicist, basically was saying similar things, which is, it's sort of obvious if you look around and you ask for like a first principles argument for why humans, and in fact all living things, deserve to exist or should remain in existence, and you're just like, some bean counting entropy measurement device, then you point yourself at a human and you're like, okay, well, if I got rid of all of them, that'd be pretty hard to reproduce, because, well, they're the product of billions of years of evolution, and not only they, but the ecosystems they evolved with and the non-living parts of those environments. That's an enormous amount of compute if I was to try and reproduce it. And it's very unclear how much of that ended up baked into them as individuals in their genomes and so on. But that's a lot of information, and, well, geez, it would be a pain to have to reproduce that if I someday wanted it. And anyway, there maybe aren't so many runs of such things around. Given the scale of the universe, it's pretty unique. So maybe I'll just leave them alone and go build my diamond civilization on Jupiter. And that has it's kind of attractive in some ways. I think there's probably some truth to it. I think that is part of the intrinsic value of human beings. Certainly, I think we should find some solace in that. But I think it's pretty unclear how to aim at that exactly, right? I think it's also a little bit fine gradations of meaning make a lot of difference when you're talking about aligning a superintelligence. And if you just say, what do you mean exactly by curiosity? I think you have to really have a book length definition of the precise form of curiosity that leads you to preserve that system, rather than, and all humans, or do you just, certainly you could take half the humans and put them on Mars and give them 3 legs, and because you're very curious about what they would do in that scenario. Does that destroy the intrinsic value in the remaining half of the human race? Well, probably not. Or if it did, then surely humans are, by that bean counting, awful, because we run around killing each other all the time, and therefore removing a lot of the uniqueness or whatever. So maybe the first step, if you're maximally curious and want to preserve the optionality of studying these amazing snowflakes that are human beings, is to first deprive human beings of all agency over themselves, because they're busy removing this precious supply of snowflakes. So I don't know that maximizing curiosity seems super safe to me.
I just to build on that, I think there's also this assumption, this sort of you're smuggling this assumption about other potential systems that might exist in comparison to humans and other, Earth's terrestrial biology, basically, of which humans are a component. And boy, sorry, I'm not making this very clear. More straightforwardly, you're assuming in this argument about curiosity that humans are near some pinnacle of interestingness in the space of all possible systems. And of course, that could be dangerously wrong, right? Perhaps we're more interesting than rocks. And so maybe this is, Musk was saying something very much along these lines, that Mars is less interesting than Earth, right? Because Mars is just rocks and Earth is rocks and a biosphere. But it does not follow that Earth's biosphere is interesting compared to systems that are possible. For example, systems that, virtual biospheres, for example, of countless variety, compared to what might exist computationally in a virtual universe, or in physical terms in a designed universe. I say universe, but you take some Diamond Age construct built out of Jupiter. I mean, you could build millions of new ecosystems, virtual and real, none of which are, protein-based nanotechnology, and they might all be more interesting than the proteins-based nanotechnology that we call terrestrial biology. And so it's a dangerous, I think, potentially quite false assumption to assume that humanity and then the rest of biology attached to, of which we are a part, is anywhere near some peak on the landscape of all possible interesting systems that our universe could harbor. And if an AI is maximally curious, and it wants to explore that possible landscape, well, it has to get busy creating those other systems that are more interesting. And maybe we're standing in the way of that, as maybe more of an obstacle rather than a local peak of enormous interest. So even though we could be very rare in the universe as such, Fermi paradox and all that, we could be completely mundane and boring compared to what might be creatable and designable, or buildable at any rate, by an artificial superintelligence in fairly short order. So yeah, I don't think there's necessarily a whole lot of comfort in the assumption that humanity and the terrestrial biosphere are innately interesting. We might be, but it doesn't mean we're interesting in absolute terms compared to all other kinds of possible systems that might exist. So it's pretty dangerous to assume. You might get more mileage out of saying, well, we have an authenticity that is sort of inalienable. I mean, if it is genuinely extremely rare for complex life to evolve and technological sophistication and general intelligence to evolve naturally, our rareness might give us more value and interest, in the same way that I've used this analogy elsewhere, but the original Mona Lisa painting is priceless, and no matter how good a copies or facsimiles are, they're worthless. And the original is the only version, the only copy with authenticity, and so authenticity, I can kind of see that as a having some paramount value, if you squint at it the right way. But in terms of us just being valuable because we're complex or interesting as far as systems go, I don't know. I'd be wary about resting a whole lot of weight in that, because that could, we could turn out to be a very measly bump in the landscape of peak interestingness that our universe can support.
I think this is a trap that we need to move through as quickly as possible, frankly. I think trying to look for authenticity or interestingness, it's like the last vestige of anthropocentrism. We've given up our position in the universe steadily, bit by bit, and we still retain this belief that maybe we're intrinsically interesting or something, and therefore if we produce some objective enough system, like a god in the machine that just has the real values of the universe somehow, that it will care about us. This has a very it's this kind of Christian idea. I don't know, if there was a God, he would see our true value deep inside or something. I think it's much more likely that we should just move on, accept that actually we're completely uninteresting and of no value. We're just animated dust, and our intelligence will turn out to be, for example, pretty pathetic given time, etc. Let's just move all the way to accepting that intrinsically there's no reason for any objective thing to value us. And so we accept the burden of aligning the thing, right? So it's not going to discover that
you're forgetting one possibility, which I know you guys don't like, and that's the Neuralink pathway in transhumanism. If you can't beat him, join him. That's the other way, right?
For
so
sure.
we're not that interesting, and we're just animated dust, and we're not that smart. But please just take us along for the ride.
Yeah,
just take us for the ride. Instead of wiping us out, let us merge with you. That's the and I'm like 99.9% on board that path. That's my ticket. But that's as a lifelong transhumanist. So there we go.
That's Adam. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. But to come back to XAI, I think, as you said, I mean, we do want to. It makes rational sense if you have, timelines that are shorter than 100 years and don't think the problem is trivial, to be spending a large amount on many different approaches, and that is not what's taking place. I mean, there are pretty well-funded groups in some of these research labs, but they're all pursuing pretty similar objectives and basically are betting on the problem being to some extent easy or off in the future. So I do actually find it encouraging that Musk is funding a research organization like this aimed explicitly at really tackling some deep fundamental problems in the nature of these systems. Maybe the headline maximize curiosity thing I find unconvincing / dangerous, but they're very smart people, and I kind of hope they succeed in understanding the systems well enough to even make progress on aiming it at maximizing curiosity. So I guess overall, I think it's a good thing. I don't know if, Matt, you have a take on XAI.
Yeah, I mentioned in the chat that the curiosity goal is, we already discussed how that might not be like, that might be just the public version of what's going on. But it seems similar to me to two things that we've discussed. Some of us have discussed in the past. So Yoshua Bengio had an article about how if you want to solve AI safety, you should just automate scientific research and discovery, because scientists, like an ideal super scientist, would be inherently safe, according to him. I wasn't convinced by that article. The other thing is, when we discussed in the AI safety seminar, Friston and some of the free energy principle people had an article about how if you just maximize like the truth of your beliefs, like your predictive power over the universe, then you, I don't know, they seem to be saying something like, therefore everyone will like get along, and it'll be a great society of like exchanging beliefs with each other and stuff. When we read that in the seminar, in the reading group, we also weren't convinced that there weren't these failure modes like we've been discussing, where you like take away all agency from the humans, or you kill them because they're unpredictable and you don't like that. And the Friston lesson is basically, I mean, I think this is an important lesson. It's like, there are two ways that you can improve the accuracy of your world model. And that one of them is to update your world model by, becoming more knowledgeable about the world. And the other way is to change the world so that it conforms more to your world model. And I don't feel like you can really fundamentally separate these two options, so you have one without the other, because if you want to act in the world, I mean, I don't know if I can explain why I don't think you can fundamentally separate these, but it seems pretty fundamental to me. There are these two options, and one of them is safe and one of them is not. So that's dangerous overall.
Yep. There's one other aspect of XAI I think I want to highlight, which is more broadly interesting in this conversation, which is as part of the announcement, they made a big deal out of this part. So the advertisement for why you should come and work at XAI. And Musk's very good at founding these things. He always has this, like, he's good at doing the publicity, and he always has like the the hiring pitch as part of the announcement. He does this sort of reliably with all his companies, and presumably, he has the star power to attract pretty good people. Yeah, it's part of the hype machine, and that is his like core skill, I guess. He advertised why you should come to work at XAI if you're an amazing ML researcher or mathematician or whatever, is that you would have access to a large amount of compute, which is, of course, part of the reason why people want to go and do research at OpenAI or Google versus academia or elsewhere. And this is interesting, and I think throws a lot of the other, probably is the wild card that makes a lot of the other things we're discussing kind of irrelevant. Like, what's the point of being an independent researcher? You're free, you get to choose your research agenda, when actually human productivity is like just valuable insofar as its leverage on machine productivity. And if you're an independent researcher with your, sub 100K salary, you're not going to be buying access to, the $500,000 a year super researcher augmentation tool. Whereas if you're inside one of these companies and you're sort of inside the bubble of this new economy where access to the GPUs is much cheaper for you, it's basically like being inside a different civilization with a different, economy of research productivity. So if you're in XAI and you get to run many GPUs, you can do many experiments. You can, if these tools work and Sketty is successful and you can prove more theorems, well, then independent research is for chumps. You join up with the civilization that is winning. Otherwise, you get left behind, full stop. So I don't know if that's the future we're moving into, but I guess that's downstream of my predictions, and I guess it's a prediction I don't like, so I try not to think about it. But if we're moving into a world where AGI is kind of within 10 years, then sometime between now and then we're in an intermediate regime where you're either augmenting your research with AIs or you're left behind. And to augment it with AIs, you need good price per flop. And so maybe that means that all research is swallowed into XAI, OpenAI, Google, DeepMind, etc., just merely for cost reasons. So maybe that's the real disruption of research, and there's like no future for FROs, independent research orgs. Everything belongs to the people with the GPUs. Yeah,
we've seen some historical precedent for when the barrier of when after picking all of the low-hanging fruit that an independent scientist, independent researcher, tinkerer, inventor could pick, that it then became the barrier to entry, the upfront cost, the ante to get in the game of invention, then innovation became so great that individuals couldn't do it, with very rare, extremely wealthy exceptions. I think maybe in the 18th and 19th centuries and into the early 20th century, we had some of that where, things were discoverable as an individual lone wolf tinkerer, or inventable, I suppose, in the 1800s and in the early 1900s, in a way that by post-World War II, there was not much low-hanging fruit available for the independent, the proverbial inventor to collect. There wasn't anything left, and then a new frontier opened with computing and software innovation and so forth. And then it did become possible to invent marvelous new things with software in your dorm room or in your basement or in your garage or whatever. But we may maybe we've aged out of that regime once again, and we're now we've run up against the wall here, where you really are resource constrained in being able to push ahead in the frontier now. But I think I would argue that we've been in analogous situations in the past as far as innovation and invention go. So I don't know if there are any lessons to glean there. I don't know if there's any hope that a new frontier could open that individuals might be able to explore if they were empowered by, the right kind of generalized tool. In the same way that computers themselves, as universal Turing machines, I guess, that were accessible to individuals. So personal computers, they opened that possibility space for, the brilliant individual researcher to create something marvelous.
Well, but in the first,
80s, 90s,
in the
2000s,
first world first. Yeah, I think that's a good example, but it actually illustrates a slightly different thing, which is that access to computers was highly unequal. So you had places like the United States have ubiquitous access to personal computing and the subsequent sort of opportunities open for individuals, while most of the world remained very far from that frontier.
And I think it's even worse than that. My understanding is that one from the story of Microsoft is that one of the marvelous, or not marvelous, but one of the tremendous advantages that Bill Gates had was that he had access to a computer at a time when virtually nobody else did, no other child did. He was one of the first Americans, one of the first people in the world to have access to a computer as a child, and he was able to capitalize on that enormous stroke of good fortune and privilege first, faster than others, and so it was, even within the United States, that was the wealthiest country at that time, there was gross inequity in terms of access as well, and the access and the privilege of having the hardware translated into massive first mover advantage and so forth. So I guess you're right.
It's
sort of always been a part of the picture here.
Yeah, to make the analogy explicit. So it could be that being inside, maybe characterizing it as these organizations like Google, DeepMind, OpenAI, and so on, and Microsoft is a bit, will look a bit strange in hindsight. They probably expand massively. They basically have affiliated universities or other organizations that sort of move into their orbit in order for them to scale. But wherever the boundary is drawn, where inside it you get cheap access to the latest tool and outside it you don't. The inside that boundary could be like in this new phase, like it was to be in the United States and have early access to personal computing versus being in the rest of the world. Yeah, Matt, do you want to explain what you were saying in the comment?
Yes, sorry. I think the timing is important here. So it seems like if you want to do certain kind of research today, then you already need to have access to a lot of compute. But other kinds of research, that's not quite the case yet. So for example, if you want to do science of deep learning sort of stuff, or if you want to do mechanistic interpretability on the really big models, and first of all, you need access to the weights for the big models. And second of all, you need the compute to run your experiments. But other kinds of research, still to this day, at least, in the regime where you can be competitive as an individual with a personal computer. So let's say that's going to change, and no human will be able to think competitive thoughts without significant automation in 10 years time, just to pick a random number. For the intervening 10 years, if you want to be an intellectual researcher rather than an experimentalist on the biggest models, I think it's still sensible maybe to work as an independent researcher to kind of establish yourself, because I think someone like John Wentworth, when the augmentations kind of become a necessary tool to be at the frontier, John Wentworth has the power to come in and say, well, I'm an established researcher. I'm a good investment for you to either hire or continue to fund and like give me access to these tools, and I can like help contribute. So being like a young researcher at the moment, it might be like, see if you can get like establish yourself, focus on building your career position while you can, and then long-term independent research might not make sense, but you could reevaluate as you go, and it still will have been sensible to do it at this stage. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's some wisdom in that. I guess the people with the GPUs probably have their own very well-defined interests and avenues of research. So if you're an independent researcher and go too orthogonally to that, maybe you'll find it difficult to then find a place. Whereas, which is true in research now, right? Like, there's always a trade-off between doing something that's legible to the people with power and money and grants versus doing what you think is the actual deep research that needs to be done. And ideally, actually, you need to manage both somehow by like never sleeping. That's what I think the reliable path to success is. I think there's wisdom to that, but also you'd have to play a very careful game of making sure you're maintaining the possibility of future access. But that doesn't seem crazy. I think we'll have to end there. Thanks, everybody. I think that was productive. Oh, yep.
I got just one thing to put on your radar. If you haven't heard of it already, it might be worth checking out. I don't know much about it. Is Tiny Corp and Tiny Grad. You guys heard about those? I mean, I don't know if it's the person involved is a bit of a quacky, quirky, strange fellow. Comma AI is he's a real character, but the philosophy again is quite different. I mean, the idea is to build something that's to build a fairly beefy machine that's more than a personal computer, but that can but that's you mentioned super powered researcher, right? And a researcher empowered by machinery. I think that they have something like that in mind, where you can't do much with a $500 laptop, but maybe we can make a machine for $15,000 as opposed to $150 million that you really could do useful machine learning and LLM research with, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe it would be empowering enough to act as some sort of alternative or open source empowering force in contrast to the gigantic, ultimate, hugely deep-pocketed behemoths, the Googles and the OpenAIs, et cetera. I don't know what you guys think of that, but at any rate, it's a novel approach and a different model for coming at the problem. So I thought I'd just put it on your radar in case you weren't already familiar with it.
Yeah, I think George Hotz is a very interesting example of
Hotz. That's his name, Hotz. Yeah,
many of the things we've talked about. Maybe we can talk about his example a bit next time. But we'll stop there for today. Thanks, everybody.